Great. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the Knative Community Meetup. My name is Maria Cruz. I'm a program manager in the Google Open Source Programs Office. And we have quite a packed agenda. So we are going to go ahead and get started. If you're just joining in, please find the agenda on the event details on the calendar. So without any further ado, let's start with working group updates. We have an update from the eventing working group that Bill is going to announce.
Hey, everybody. All right, just a quick update. We have basically been really heavily focusing on getting our house in order and making sure that we are well on our way on getting eventing side to be V1 ready, as in making sure that we have all the conformance tests and all the code quality bars and so forth. So that's something that's been worked on heavily. We would like to go ahead and get some more folks coming in and partying with us. It's a lot of fun. You don't want to miss this. So come and check it out. We have a couple of project boards that I'll update this after the fact, but there's that. Just visibility wise. Okay, so that's the conformance testing. The other update for everybody to know is that in version .23, aka the release after the one that it's coming up in the next 2 weeks. So this is end of May. We are dropping all the V1 beta 1 resources in the eventing, messaging, and flows. So it's all going to be V1. So plan accordingly. And we had an issue filed up that had to do with some of the webhooks and the resource allocations that was causing all kinds of hilarity because it was spinning up too many of them. So we had a community member who basically came in, filed the issue. We chatted about that, asked them to go ahead and come in and see if they could tackle it, which they did. So just wanted to say thank you for the first time contributor. Thank you. And I'm done.
Is that Fabio?
Yes.
Excellent. Well done.
I don't know how to, that's how I would pronounce it.
I found their GitHub profile on their Twitter. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Always right. Nice job.
If you're watching or you know better, please let us know.
And we have some, I think you already talked about Knative V1, right? Yeah.
I haven't talked. I want to go ahead and pass the mic to Doug, who is going to eloquently give an update on some of the work that is going on as far as the Knative as a whole. So that was more about the eventing side, how we are getting ready. And Doug is going to go ahead and chitty chat about the V1 work as a whole.
Yeah. So Maria, can I share my screen for a sec, or can get someone to click on that link that's in the agenda? One of the two is fine.
Oh yeah, let me make you a co-host so that you can share your screen. Okay, you should be able to do that now.
Okay, cool. All right, I assume that's visible, right?
Can others respond because I can't see anything?
Jules, you see that?
I see it.
Okay, perfect, thanks. Yeah, so Vili asked me to talk about what's going on with V1 from a high-level perspective, but I realized that not everybody understands or knows what's going on with the Trademark Committee, so I wanted to bring everybody very quickly up to speed there. So we made a very clear decision as part of the Trademark Committee to have a very clean separation between the Knative Trademark Committee stuff versus what we're calling the reference implementation, meaning the open source code side of the house, okay? Because there's a very large mixing between the two worlds today, and that's not really necessarily good. We want to make sure that people understand that you can be conformant to the specifications, which are owned by, in essence, the Trademark Committee and stuff like that, and not have anything to do with the open source code, right? So you can be conformant with the specs, but not have anything to do with the open source. And that's a very important distinction, okay? So just to sort of level set where we're at with that, the Trademark Committee will own obviously the trademark and the name Knative, as well as what it means to be, quote, Knative compliant, okay? Now, even though the Trademark Committee owns the trademarks for Knative, we are giving the open source reference implementation special rights to go ahead and use the name, because it's the default reference implementation, historical reasons, whatever you want to call it. That thing is special. Okay, so we can continue to use the name for everything. That's fine. And unless you guys do something that really upsets us, then we'll end that, but that's not going to happen. Now, with that though, aside from the name, we need to move over the specifications into a repo. So we created a specs repo and move all the the specifications into that repo. That way it's clearly owned by the trademark committee and it's distinct and separate from the reference implementation itself. Okay. Along with that, we obviously then need to move over the conformance tests. Okay. So everything's now going to be under this specs repo for the trademark committee. Okay. Now the trademark committee will then will define what it means to be compliant or conforming to the conformance specifications, and what it means to actually be conformant and how long that lasts, you know, stuff like that. We'll define all those rules around that in the not too distant future. Okay. We also need to go back and update the TOC and steering committee charters, because the language in there right now is a little bit fuzzy in terms of who actually owns what. In fact, I think the steering committee actually has a sentence or two that kind of implies they own the specs or they own the name and stuff like that. So we need to clean that up a little just to make that split a little bit clearer. Now, everything I talked about here is from a strict legalistic perspective, meaning we're trying to get a clean separation. That way there's a clear delegation of who owns what, and everything's very clear from quote legalistic perspective. Now, having said that though, in the real world, the trademark committee does not work in isolation. Okay, we are obviously going to be heavily influenced and expect to be influenced by the open source community, whether it be the reference implementation or just anybody who just happens to want to contribute to the specs. Okay, so we expect a lot of collaboration between the trademark committee and the open source code teams to make sure that everybody's in sync, everybody's happy. Okay, it's just we need a clear legal separation between the two worlds. Okay. Any questions on that before I move forward? Just want to level set everybody in terms of where we are in terms of process.
It's probably
anybody with Jules. Sorry, no, I wasn't clear. No, go ahead, Jules.
Yeah, I mean, you'll regret not saying that sooner.
I know.
It may just be misspeaking. It sounded like you were saying that because you were kind of differentiating between OSS reference implementation and KTC spec, and that sort of implies that the spec isn't either open source or developed in the open, and that seems wrong, right? Like I thought that the open source community developed two things: a reference implementation and a specification that anyone can implement. And the KTC owns a trademark and needs to sign off on what the open source community does in terms of changing that spec. But I didn't think that when we created the KTC, we were creating kind of we were saying the open source community doesn't own the specs anymore. If you see what I mean.
Well, no, so you're right. If I implied that the specifications are not open sourced, that is not true. They are definitely open source. It's just there's an open source spec and then there's open source reference implementation.
But are they not owned by the same open source community that owns? I mean, they're open source, obviously, right? Yes. I can go and get the source of them. But are they not owned by the steering committee? Are they not owned by the TOC? I know KTC has to sign off on them, but
no, KTC.
I mean, they are developed by the same community, aren't they?
No, KTC owns the specs from a strict legalistic perspective, and the steering committee and TOC own the reference implementation. There is a very clear delineation between the two. Because technically, if you think about it, if one day the reference implementation decides to just vanish, the specs will live on. So who owns that? It's the KTC.
I mean, I kind of thought also the reference implementation. If the whole open source community disappeared, the code would not, right? And KTC would own that too. I think someone is trying to. I know, maybe not.
Well, we could take this offline, but that's the current state of thinking. Maybe the wording isn't quite right, but there are definitely two different owning organizations, KTC and then open source code world.
I see. I mean, you know, maybe that's, I mean, certainly if steering is signed it off, then I'm, you know, who am I to say anything?
That's true. Who are you? Yeah, I agree.
It felt to me like when we had the original discussions about KTC, we were quite careful to say that, given that Katie isn't kind of representative, it would be kind of a legalistic owning thing and would sign off on changes, but it wasn't taking kind of an ownership of a whole kind of area.
That's why I tried to be very clear that this first major bullet is all from a strict legalistic perspective, but reality is the second bullet, right? We don't expect, Brenda, Ron, and myself to be the only one making changes to the specs. In fact, chances are we will never make changes to the specs. It's the open source folks that will be doing that through PRs.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So moving forward, then let's get to the good stuff. V1. So there were a couple of steps necessary to get to V1 from a spec perspective. Obviously, we talked about two of them already. Right? Move the specs, move the conformance test to the spec repo, and Madi already did that. So thank you to him for making that happen. Whoops. Okay. Now, in terms of actually getting over the finish line to V1, what we'd like to do is this. Hopefully in a previous TOC call, and I apologize, I haven't been attending those recently. Hopefully through the TOC call, we've been made aware, or the WGs have been made aware that they need to go and start reviewing the specifications, okay? Reviewing them to make sure that they have everything they need in terms of feature-wise for V1, make sure there isn't stuff that's been slipped in by mistake that people don't want to support for V1. Basically just make sure it's V1 ready from a text perspective, okay? If people would like to make changes, they can follow the normal PR process just to the specs repo. And we haven't decided on the formal deadline for when we want to get all found issues or our review cycle to be finished. But later this week, when we have the KTC meeting, I'm going to propose that we shoot for an end of April date for all the PRs to be found. Hopefully, we'll resolve them relatively quickly, and hopefully there aren't many at all. But when all those PRs are resolved, then we can go forward and say, okay, folks, we're planning on this being V1/GA of the specs. Then the reference implementation can decide when they want to go GA, right? Technically, they can go GA even before that if they really, really wanted to, but that's up to them. It's since they're separate entities, okay? Now, from a conformance testing perspective, we would try to move as quickly as possible to get that all set up in terms of the rules and regulations, make sure the test suite works properly, but we decided that we're not going to hold up GA for that. Okay, that way GA can happen at the appropriate time from a technical perspective, and we'll worry about the bureaucracy later as necessary, because I know people are very anxious to get to GA. Okay, anyway, that's the current thought process, and I just want to bring you guys up to speed, and if anybody has any questions.
So what happens if an implementation only passes a percentage of the conformance test?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So the way we've been thinking about that particular question isn't so much only do a percentage, because no one has suggested, oh, I only want to do 50% of serving. The problem has always been stated as, well, what if I want to be eventing compliant, but not serving compliant, that kind of stuff. And we do want to allow that kind of thing. And I got to be honest with you, we had a conversation about this last week, and I don't remember exactly where we landed, but we are definitely going to try to accommodate those people, because there are organizations out there like, for example, Trigger Mesh, who I believe is only doing eventing stuff and not serving stuff. And we want them to be able to get some sort of seal of approval, right? So I'll have to go back and double check on the full answer, Max, but we are definitely considering that type of scenario.
So you'll be Knative, you can call yourself Knative, but you'll have an asterisk or something like that?
Yeah, honestly, I apologize. I can't remember whether it's yes, you'll be able to say I'm Knative compliant, or whether you have to say I'm Knative eventing compliant. I can't remember for sure the exact wording, but there's something like that that will be agreed to.
I see. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions, comments?
Doug, you said that the conformance tests that are the minimum to define to meet the API specification are in that repo specs. I don't see any tests there.
They're in the process, or maybe they're not moved yet. Maybe I jumped the gun.
No,
I thought they were maybe they were in the process of being moved.
No, so for the first, that is the goal where we want to get to go ahead and make progress. We have kept these in the eventing repo for the eventing, and then we have been using, say, RabbitMQ Broker as keeping us honest to make sure that we are not just testing the core. But the long-term goal is to move them into the repo, into the Knative specs repo, but it is not there yet.
Thank you, Billy. I didn't realize it wasn't there yet.
Yeah, and to that, eventing is doing a great job of documenting or writing down the laundry list. So if any in the community is watching this and want to contribute on writing tests or in test area, there's a lot of work that you can contribute. So that's my 2 cents.
All right, we should probably hand it back to the other folks who have a better presentation to talk about than on this stuff. But I'll be online answering questions if you guys have anything.
Thank you so much, Doug. I think we have one more update from the UX working group, and then we need to dive into the demo.
Yeah, I can give the update is 1 minute. So last time that we were in the meetup, I think we were in the process of creating a working group, a new working group for user experience. And this time around, that process is complete. We went through the TOC. We did all the mechanics. We have now a repository. We're using a GitHub project roadmap, which is the link is in the agenda. You can go out there and there's about 6 items, cards in there. They call outcomes. And that's if somebody wants to see what we're working on, or they want to help with one of those outcomes in the roadmap, you can sign up there, make a comment, or join the Slack channel in the user experience channel. So we gave a presentation to the TOC, was our turn. So the recording is available if you want to see what are the things that we did in terms of user interviews, analysis, design thinking, and management of the working group. Yeah, we're open for contributions and members. That's all.
Yeah, just to build on that, if you're interested in sitting in on user interviews or want to do some user experience work, please reach out to myself or Carlos and we can get you involved. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you both. Sorry to hustle through the last updates. I think with that, we're going to pass it to Srini, who is going to present the demo for today. Release automation for Knative Apps with iteration or iterate, sorry.
All right, so I'm sharing my screen. Are you able to see it? Give me a sign if you can see it, or let me know.
Yeah, we see.
Good. All right, so hello, everybody. My name is Srinivasan. I'm a research scientist at IBM Research New York, and I'm here to introduce the Iterate project to the Knative community today. The Iterate project is made possible by contributions by a number of wonderful people. I've listed their names here, and this is a growing list, and hopefully will continue to grow. Okay, so what is Iterate? Iterate is an open source platform for cloud native release automation and experimentation. And as developers of Kubernetes apps or machine learning models, we have often we have a number of goals. Maybe we want to, in a Canary test, we want to validate our Canary release, Canary version is satisfying service level objectives. Or maybe you're doing a A/B test or an ABN experiment, and you want to identify the best version. You have a number of versions of your application. You want to compare them and maybe pick the one that maximizes the business objective of interest to you, maximizes user engagement, maximizes revenue, minimizes cost, whatever. Pick the best version. And in doing these types of releases, in doing these types of experiments, we also want to protect the end user experience. So if a version is satisfying SLOs, maybe we want to shift traffic to it gradually. But if it's not satisfying SLOs, we want to minimize its exposure to end users. And maybe we want to bring in other safety mechanisms like traffic shaping, traffic mirroring, and segmentation to limit exposure of versions to users before they are fully rolled out. And we also want to safely promote and roll back versions if necessary. This is the point of Iterate. Iterate makes it possible. Iterate gives you a number of features that makes it possible to achieve these goals automatically as part of your releases. So here are a few key features that are available today for Knative app developers. And we are going to see many of these features as part of the demos. that you can start using these features today as part of your Knative releases. The number one feature here is a Kubernetes custom resource called experiment. And you can use this experiment resource to declaratively specify what do you want to achieve as part of the experiment, or as part of your validation task, or as part of your release task. In particular, you can use this experiment to say that you want to do a conformance test. This is a different conformance test than what we heard about before. This is really about validating SLOs using metrics. And you can do a Canary test where you have two versions and you're comparing two versions. You can progressively shift traffic to a particular version of your application, and based on how it performs with respect to metrics. You can specify SLOs or SLIs based on metrics, and you can also bring in more, integrate more advanced features like dark launches, traffic mirroring, and segmentation, which we will see today. And you can also integrate experiments with app configuration tools like Helm and Customize. So these are some features at a glance, and these are things that you can start using today. All right, so let's dive into our first demo. This is a conformance testing demo for a Knative app. And once again, by conformance testing, what we mean is that your app, this version of your app satisfies SLOs that are specified within the experiment. This is the scenario that we are going to demo. You have a single version of your Knative application. So we will see that this is actually a Knative revision. In Knative, versions correspond to revisions. So you have a Knative revision. And the picture says that it's really a production version. So it's receiving user traffic and it's serving requests from users. So in reality, you can do the step conformance test either with a production version or in a staging environment. It's really up to you which version you pick to do this experiment on. Essentially, as part of a conformance test, you're going to continually validate the version and check if it is going to satisfy SLOs that you care about. In this experiment, we will specify latency SLOs, and we will specify error rate SLOs, but the SLOs can be based on any metrics that are available to you. And this is how the demo is about to unfold. So manually, I'm going to launch a Knative service with a single revision. And then I will launch the iterate conformance experiment. And iterate is going to automate several steps for me. So it is going to, first of all, it's going to do some basic checking in the beginning. It's going to verify that the Knative version actually exists. It's not a non-existent revision. And all the metrics that I specify within the experiment, they actually exist. And then it's going to periodically query the metrics backend, in this case Prometheus. It's going to fetch the latency and error rate metrics, and it's going to evaluate the version. And if it satisfies the SLOs, it is going to declare it as a winner. If it doesn't satisfy the SLOs, then it's just going to report that it doesn't satisfy your objectives. This is a very simple introductory experiment for us to get started with Iterate and Knative. There are more advanced demos coming up shortly. So let's head over. Everything that I am going to talk about today is documented here as part of iterate.tools. So you can try out this experiment at your home in a couple of minutes. So let me go to the conformance testing. As I said, I'm going to launch my Knative application. Oh, so I'm gonna say that I already set up a few things here, right? So obviously I have a local Kubernetes cluster and it's running Knative, and it's also has got iterate installed. So some of the setup has been taken care of in the background already so that I can get started with the demo. So I've gone ahead and launched this Knative service. It's a very simple service taken from Knative tutorials. I have a sample app v1, and it's a blue version of this application. That is a service that I'm going to conformance test. Of course, in a real environment, in a production environment, your service is probably receiving user requests, real user requests. But in this demo, I'm just going to simulate user requests by generating a few requests myself using this tool called Fabio. All right, so I'm about to create the iterate experiment, but let's take a quick look at what this experiment is going to do. So first of all, I specified that the target of my experiment is this particular Knative service. So sample app service in the default namespace. And if we dive a little bit deeper, I'm specifically saying within that service, there is a revision called sample app v1. Pick that up. That is what we are going to do our experiment with. And we want to validate this version by verifying it satisfies these objectives. So these are the objectives that I would like my version to satisfy. Its mean latency needs to be within 50 milliseconds. Its tail latency needs to be within 100 milliseconds, and its error rate needs to be within 1%. If I see these things happening, then I would say, yes, your version is great. Otherwise, well, not me, but iterate is going to say your version is great. Otherwise, iterate is going to declare that your version is not satisfying objectives. And there are other things. There is a initialization action that I'm specifying here. So it's going to do, as I said, some sanity checks, whether this version and service actually exists, whether these metrics actually exist. Metrics is also a Kubernetes CRD that iterate actually defines. So it's going to verify all these things for you automatically. Let's go ahead and launch this experiment. Okay, experiment is created. Now we want to see what this experiment is actually doing. There is a little CLI tool that Iterate provides called Iterate CTL. You can use it to periodically see how the experiment is proceeding and what the experiment is reporting back. The experiment looks like it's just getting started, so there is no data coming back. We'll look into what is coming back, but experiment itself is a Kubernetes resource, so we can just kubectl get it. We are seeing that there are 3 iterations of the experiment that are completed. Going back to the experiment, I missed one part. So the duration of the experiment says that there are 10 iterations of the experiment. And in between each iteration, there is a 10-second gap. So periodically, iterate is doing this metrics fetch followed by evaluation of the version. Looks like it's now beginning to get some metrics from the metrics backend. There are a few requests that have gone to your version, and it is reporting back the mean latency, the tail latency, error rate, and your version is doing great. All the objectives are satisfied, and looks like it's doing well. So as I said, this is a very, very simple conformance experiment, but it already demonstrates how iterate validates your application and your application version in this simple setting. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this experiment and move on to hopefully what is a bit more interesting experiment. So in between these demos, I need to do a little cleanup so that my demo environment is fit for the next step. All right, so let's go back and look at our next demo. Here's what we're going to do in the next demo. We're going to do a Canary release of a Knative application. And once again, so in a Canary release, you obviously have a baseline version and you have a candidate version that you're Canary releasing. Once again, we are going to do validation of these versions. We are going to check if they satisfy the SLOs that you specify in the experiment. But this time, we are going to progressively shift traffic to the candidate if it satisfies the SLOs. And at the end of the experiment, assuming the candidate is doing well and it's found to be a good one, not a problem, it satisfies everything that you want it to satisfy, we will promote it. In other words, it will become the new baseline. It will essentially take over all of the traffic. That's what that's how the experiment ideally should end. So this is the picture. Once again, we have user traffic. In the beginning, candidate is going to get a very small percentage of the traffic, but hopefully we are going to continually, iterate is going to continually validate it, and iterate is going to certify that this is a good candidate. And as it does so, hopefully we will see iterate shifting the traffic from the baseline to the candidate version automatically. And for this traffic shifting, it is actually going to use a Knative service resource. It's going to use the traffic spec as part of the service resource to do this traffic shifting. And as I said, in the end, it's going to automatically promote your candidate version because it would emerge as the winner in this experiment. It would have satisfied all the SLOs, and it will end up being the one and only revision. The other baseline will be garbage collected by Knative. All right, so once again, this is how the experiment is going to unfold. I'm going to launch the 2 versions, launch the experiment, and iterate is going to do all of that magic for me. Verify, progressively shift traffic, and declare a winner and promote at the end of the experiment. All right, so let's head over to this experiment. All right. So a lot of the setup steps, Kubernetes cluster, iterate, Knative install, everything is done already. So I'm going to go ahead straight to this step where I'm creating Knative app versions. So this is once again the simple sample application with a blue version, and then upgrading it to a green version. And in the beginning, the green version is not going to receive any traffic. It's just, deployed, but not receiving traffic at the moment. That's how the server specification is specified. Let's send some requests. Once again, it's using a 4-year job to synthetically generate some requests and send it to these versions. Let's look at the experiment before launching it. There are a few other things going on. So once again, I have a target of the experiment, and the target is my sample app Knative service in the default namespace. But this time, I have more things, more details specified for the version. So I have, first of all, not 1, but 2. I have a baseline version and a candidate version. A baseline is sample app v1. Baseline is just a way for me to say if anything goes wrong, not able to do the experiment properly even, or candidate is not working out, just go back to the baseline. So it's a fallback mechanism. So baseline is my sample app v1, and revision, the candidate revision, is sample app v2. Oh, sorry about the background noise. Maybe I'll head over to different space. Hopefully the background noise will subside. So that's about the versions themselves. Once again, I'm using the same criteria. I'm using the same objectives: mean latency, tail latency, and error rate metrics. And here is the action that I'm specifying as part of the experiment for doing the version promotion. So when the experiment finishes, I can simply use a kubectl apply command. It's not me who is using it. It's the iterate experiment, which is automating this step for me. It's going to use this kubectl apply command and launch the appropriate version. If the version that needs to be promoted is the baseline, it will launch the baseline. It will kubectl apply the baseline manifest. Otherwise, it will kubectl apply the candidate manifest. So you end up promoting the right version depending upon which version ends up as the winner during the experiment. All right, so this is the experiment. Let's go ahead and launch the experiment. All right, experiment created. Once again, let's use iterate.ctl to start monitoring how the experiment is unfolding. Nothing has happened so far. It's just starting up. Let's look at the status of the experiment, the stage of the experiment here by doing a kubectl watch of the experiment. A couple of iterations of the experiment are over. And let's also watch the traffic in the service itself. All right. So, okay. So this is the output from iterate.ctl. There are four iterations of the experiment that are complete. And apparently, it's still not getting metrics for any of these versions. Let's see. Maybe we just need to wait. Sometimes there's a Prometheus scraping process that goes on in the background, and sometimes it just takes time to scrape the metrics. So what we see here in the status is that the traffic shift is held at 95.5, right? So you're not actually seeing traffic shifting from baseline to revision to the candidate because, you know, we are not getting any metrics for the baseline or the candidates. So traffic is actually held at 95% for the baseline and candidate at 5%. I wonder what's going on. Unavailable, unavailable, unavailable. So I want to check one quick thing. All right. So there was a downtime with Quay.io, which is actually, I'm using a Red Hat operator for launching Prometheus pods. And up until last night, this the container registry was down at Quay, and I'm wondering if it has something to do with it. So the experiment actually is finishing, but it's not finishing the way I want it to actually finish. I was hoping to see some metrics here and traffic shifting to the candidate, but that it didn't quite unfold as I was hoping it would. But you can see that if the candidate is not validated, the other rollback mechanism actually kicked in. The experiment is over, and iterate has actually gone ahead and rolled back the candidate. 100% of the traffic is now going back to the baseline because it could not confidently declare the candidate as being the winner in this experiment. That's what you're saying. That's not what I was thinking we will see, but that's exactly what happened during the experiment. So let's go ahead and see if we can proceed to the next experiment where maybe we will see something else. So the candidate winning as part of the experiment. I'm going to go ahead and do one cleanup step here. All right. Experiment has been cleaned up and the services have been cleaned up. All right, so let me go to the next experiment, the next demo that I want to show you, which is Canary release of a Knative app for a targeted user segment, right? So once again, there is going to be a Canary release experiment, and then once again, hopefully we will see some progressive traffic shifting in this particular instance. But we are going to segment the traffic and use only a portion of our user base to do the experiment. And this is how the demo scenario looks like. So you have once again, you have a baseline version and a candidate version, but we are only going to use traffic from a specific country called Wakanda in our experiment. All the users from Wakanda, they will be split between the baseline and the candidate during the experiment. But if you are not from Wakanda, then you are going to end up seeing only the baseline. There is the rest of the world is not going to, essentially, it's not going to participate in this experiment. It has a clean path to the baseline. But if you're from Wakanda, then we have an experiment for you, and you will either go to baseline or the candidate. Based on the traffic split percentage, we will split the traffic from Wakanda. Once again, we have the same SLOs that we want to verify for the baseline and candidate versions. And once again, hopefully we will progressively roll out the candidate, but this time the progressive rollout will happen only for users within Wakanda. As I said, all the other users, they are unaffected by this experiment. Even if the candidate is doing very well, the rest of the users, we don't want the rest of the users to see the candidate version because we want to minimize the exposure. That's the idea. So this time I'm going to go ahead, launch 2 different Knative services. So I'm going to use some Istio magic under the covers to do this experiment, right? Because the traffic segmentation is a capability that I actually get from Istio Virtual Services. So I can overlay that on top of the Knative resources that I'm creating to achieve this experiment here. So I'm going to go ahead and create 2 Knative services. So my 2 versions here are Knative services, not revisions, but Knative services. And I will split traffic between them based on headers. I'll check if a request is from Wakanda. And based on that, I will decide to use it or not within the experiment. And that policy is specified as part of the Istio virtual service. And then I'll launch the experiment, and the experiment will once again do the validation and traffic shifting for me. So let's head over and go to our traffic segmentation experiment and create the versions. All right, so I've got my versions. As I said, these are two different Knative services, one blue and one green. And let's go ahead and create the Istio virtual service. What is this virtual service saying? So if you look at the virtual service, I have a custom host. If you're doing this in production, you probably have your own host for which you're routing traffic. I have a custom host, and I'm saying if the request for this host comes from Wakanda, I can split it between the baseline and the candidate version. But if the request for this host is coming from elsewhere other than Wakanda, we just go to the baseline version. It's not going to participate in this experiment. That's what the virtual service is letting me do. Let's go ahead and generate some traffic. And this time, the traffic generation is a little bit more involved. So I have traffic coming from Wakanda to my services, and I have traffic coming from Gondar to my services. Gondar is just rest of the world. Once again, these are just placeholders, right? You can segment the traffic in any whichever way that Istio actually allows you to segment the traffic. It can be based on headers. It can be based on country headers, user headers. It can be based on other parts of the request also. Okay, so let's go ahead and launch the iterate experiment. All right, so experiment has been launched. Let's start watching the experiment. Experiment is just starting. Couple of iterations. And let's also watch the virtual service in terms of what it's doing with the traffic. Wow. Okay, this time I'm getting some metrics, looking hopeful now. Okay, so I am getting metrics for my baseline version. And yes, the baseline version is satisfying all the SLOs. True, 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 because its mean latency is within 50 milliseconds, its state latency is within 100 milliseconds, and its error rate is 0. And looks like I'm beginning to get some metrics for my candidate versions also. The candidate version is also satisfying all the SLOs that are specified as part of the experiment here. And the experiment is proceeding, and traffic is beginning to shift. Initially, it was a 595 split between the baseline and the candidate, or between the candidate and the baseline. But now you see the candidate taking on 45% of the traffic and the baseline at 55%. Once again, this is all traffic from within Wakanda. The non-Wakandan users from the rest of the world are just left undisturbed for the purpose of this experiment. All right.
Srini, you have 2 more minutes left. I just want to allow a few minutes at the end to have a conversation about your demo.
Perfect timing. Perfect. So I'm done with all the demos. So you can head over to iterate.tools because there are more demos out there. And for example, you can do a dark launch of your Knative application, and you can use traffic mirroring, another of Istio's capabilities, to route traffic. And you can do other things like, I showed you Istio networking layer, but Knative supports other networking layers, and you can experiment with iterate, with Knative, with other networking layers also. Soon, we're going to be releasing a couple of new releases of iterate, where you will be able to go beyond Prometheus and get metrics from any REST API. And we also are planning to include support for A/B and ABN experiments, which I mentioned but did not demo today. And we also want to enable GitOps experiments, right? Use experiments as part of your GitOps pipelines and CI/CD pipelines. So you'll start seeing more samples along these dimensions. Oh, we do have a KubeCon and Cloud Native Con Europe 2021 talk. And the Iterate team will be talking about best practices in Kubernetes experimentation. So if you're attending KubeCon, be sure to check us out there. All right, so you can join us on iterate.tools on our Slack channel workspace, and you can also check out our repos and raise questions or comments there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Srini. As you were mentioning, you have a presentation, right, at KubeCon, and you mentioned to me that you were interested in getting some feedback from the Knative community. So I just wanted to share that with everyone here. There were a ton of comments and some questions in the chat. If this is available to you, can you unmute and maybe start the conversation with a question or comment that you may have for
Let's head over to the chat. Yes. I'm hearing a big echo.
So we were trying to answer the questions on the fly, Sri. So perhaps if there are additional questions.
Well, this is Max. I don't have a question, but I have a comment, which is that I love it, and this is very timely. I think we need to figure out how to use this more, but we'll be following up. I guess this is all open source. Just to be clear, it's all open source under. I'm looking at the repos right now. The license is compatible, right, with what we have right now in Canary.
Apache v2, it's all open source. It's permissive licensing, should be compatible, I believe.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
For KubeCon, use Grafana. It is more visual for people to follow along. Yes, we do have a story for Grafana. We want to bring metrics other than Prometheus metrics into Grafana, so it might take a little bit more time, but yes, we are doing that. I'm just seeing other questions here. Example.com, okay. Right, looks like Fabio already took on many of these questions, all the questions here in the chat.
Yeah.
so if you have more questions or comments, you see, part of the reason why we are doing this presentation is to understand the needs of the Knative community, right? So what are the types of release automation pain points, and what are the types of experimentation needs and pain points that are worthwhile attacking? So this is an initial presentation, and this is definitely based on our interaction with the Istio community. It's based on our interaction with the KF serving community. But for the Knative community, if there are other comments, concerns, needs, we absolutely want to get that feedback. We want to understand what is useful to build as part of Iterate. So that's definitely the type of feedback which we would benefit a lot from.
I have the opposite question. What do you want from us? Like, what did you find good, or what could improve about Knative? Like, when you were building something like this, what's your kind of feedback to us in the same way?
That's a good question. So internally, when I was demoing it, in fact, to Doug, who is on the call here, his suggestion was that, hey, why not do the traffic segmentation using Knative service instead of using Istio virtual service? And my answer was that Knative service doesn't support features like that, probably because, you know, Istio does, and Knative is meant to work on top of multiple networking layers. So I don't know the answer, but anyway, so some of these features that makes experimentation interesting, that makes experimentation useful, perhaps it's worth considering how to bring that in as part of the Kubernetes service resources going forward. That's probably my top comment that comes to my mind.
That is, yeah, I've definitely heard that before. For what it's worth, that our current kind of traffic stuff is hard to use outside of a demo, like of Knative. Like it's hard to actually use it for anything other than the simple stuff. It's really interesting. Yeah, I definitely encourage like any issues that you could open that kind of like. I mean, I don't think it is the case that we think you should. I mean, I'm not speaking for the project, but like, I think we have a traffic section such that you shouldn't have to go down into Istio to do at least most of the stuff that you were doing there. So it'd be interesting to kind of have a, like if you had a sketch of like what would the API in Knative look like so that it could be orchestrated, I think that would be pretty cool. You can only say no anyway, right? Like it doesn't fit.
Yeah, two of the demos that I showed you does not use Istio. It's only the advanced traffic segmentation and mirroring features for which I was dipping into Istio to do it. And I was actually, following the Knative tutorials along. So there are documented, integration points between Knative and Istio that I picked up from your Knative tutorials. And I tried to do it in the most idiomatic way that Knative suggests.
Mm. Yeah.
So the other question that I do have, the obvious question, is what are some things we can do to improve adoption for iterate in the Knative community? This is obviously the top question in our heads as part of the iterate project. So any feedback along those lines would also be very welcome.
So
yeah, check your email. I just sent you one. We're going to follow up. But
okay.
Yeah, this is Max. I'm also from IBM, but we'll also follow up, with the community, obviously, with all this.
Yep.
One question for you is, I mean, this seems to be a little bit mature work. I was in research, so I'm assuming that this is based on previous work that you had before, or this is all for Knative that you did.
No, so this is definitely based on previous work before. We have worked with the Istio community, in particular the Kiali section of Istio, to support experimentation. And we've also worked with the KF serving community, which is about serverless inferencing on top of Knative, right? So, and we have some sense of what the community wants in terms of experimentation and release automation tooling. So this is based off of that. We are coming off of that. Knative seemed like an ideal target for us to go after because these features are not there for Knative. And perhaps we can gain some traction and interest within this community.
Yeah, no, superb. Thank you.
I have a question on, there's time. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So have you talked to customers or users using this in production, or have you talked to someone like actually using this in a customer setting, or this is just not just, but at this point only open source work?
It's mainly open source. However, we do have users who want to use this in production, right? So in particular, if we are engaging with them in the open, so we are talking to MLOps communities. We're talking to TripAdvisor and Selden, who are interested in using iterate features in production. And the top comment that we have right now is that if there's a way to make this GitOpsy, inject experiments in GitOps pipelines, they would be using this today. So that's the kind of feedback that we are getting, and that's definitely a direction that we are planning to head forward to pretty soon. But this is what we have heard so far from users who want to use this in production. We have more, usage in, I would say, non-production environments, but for production users, this is what we are hearing.
Yeah, so that will be my feedback. I put it in the chat, but like these things are also in YouTube, and everything in the chat is lost, by the way. So, so it's recorded. That was my feedback on GitOps, and I think Scott also had some comments in terms of production concerns and security. So my recommendation is in the web page or things like that, point out in documentation on or implementations of doing GitOps of separation of concerns. I saw like the program is doing kubectl commands against itself, or using this in a cluster that you call the management cluster, and then you have a cluster that is the dev cluster and the cluster that is production cluster. Like, how is that visibility of the things that you're changing reflected back into Git, so an operations team can monitor that. So those type of operational concerns and security and transparency are the things that the next customer that's I'm consulting with IBM with customers that we're going to put it. I work in engagements. That's the first thing that I'm going to look at. So if it's not real guidance there, and I have to like dig through the documentation to really find it, yeah, less adoption. So that's my
point taken. I appreciate the comment. The experiment that I showed you was definitely not a GitOps experiment. So just to be very clear, and you wouldn't do stuff like kubectl apply as part of a GitOps experiment. So that's not how the GitOps integration would look like. So yes.
Very good.
Does the iterate uses eventing also, or only serving?
Right now, it's only serving. We have to learn a little bit more about what it means for iterate to actually use eventing. All right, I actually want to thank the community for giving us a chance to introduce iterate to you, and hopefully we will keep moving this forward.
And thank you so much, Srini, for presenting as well. I think we have come to the close of our meetup today. We are going to upload this recording to the Canary YouTube channel, so look for it there. And if you have an implementation or an app that is running on Knative, please do consider submitting a demo as well. We have a form that I can share on the Slack space later. And thank you everybody for coming. And if you haven't filled out the survey that was launched recently, please do so we can get some feedback and continue to improve the meetup. And we'll see you next month. Thanks everybody.
Cheers.